January 31st, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands trembled as he photographed the bomber before him in intact Mitsubishi G4M Beatty, tail number 763-12. Its sleek fuselage gleamed in the tropical sunlight, the aerodynamic lines almost mocking the destructive legacy it carried. Yet what truly startled him were the secrets hidden beneath that smooth exterior. Unprotected fuel tanks, no armor, no self-sealing systems. In that moment, McCoy understood something profound. The Japanese had willingly sacrificed the safety of their crews in pursuit of speed and range, a design philosophy almost unimaginable to Western engineers. This fragile, seemingly elegant machine had once ruled the skies with terrifying authority. On December 8, 1941, barely a day after Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M bombers and 26 older G3M Nels rose from crossing the South China Sea in formations so precise they seemed almost mechanical. Their target, Clark Field in the Philippines, the heart of American air power in the region. By flying at 20,000 feet, the bombers evaded most anti-aircraft defenses, raining destruction with surgical precision. Runways were torn apart, hangars flattened, and aircraft incinerated within 45 minutes. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few who survived, would later recall the horror-perfect formation, high altitude totally beyond our reach. We couldn't get a single plane airborne. The Betty had announced itself as a weapon unlike any the world had seen. 2 days later, the Betty's reach extended to the sea. On December 10, 1941, 26 G4Ms joined older G3Ms to hunt for Z, a British naval task force, including the pride of the Royal Navy, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. Coordinated torpedo attacks, executed with near-scientific precision, struck with devastating effect. Within 2 hours, both ships were sunk, leaving 841 sailors dead. For the first time, the world witnessed that air power could dominate even the most modern battleships. A new era had dawned, one in which the sky, not the sea, could determine the fate of empires. Yet, beneath this triumph lurked a question that would haunt the Allies. How could such an elegant but fragile aircraft achieve these feats without suffering catastrophic losses? The Betty's first year in combat was a relentless campaign of speed and reach. Its operations ranged from Darwin, Australia, to Port Moresby in Guadalcanal, striking targets hundreds of miles from Japanese bases. Allied forces scrambled to respond, often too late. Airports burned, supply lines were disrupted, and every intelligence report confirmed the same terrifying truth. Yet even amid this dominance, cracks began to show in the aircraft's design. Pilots noted that a single bullet could ignite a catastrophic fire. Its very effectiveness was a gamble, a high-stakes bet on evasion and surprise over protection. By early 1942, the Betty had become more than a bomber. It was a psychological weapon. Airfields across the Southwest Pacific lived under its shadow. Each sighting of the distinctive twin tail fins and long fuselage sent crews scrambling, whether on Luzon, Darwin, or the Solomons. But while Japanese airmen celebrated their technological triumph, Allied intelligence quietly pieced together reports of vulnerabilities, exposed fuel tanks, thin fuselage, minimal defensive armament. The aircraft that had dominated so thoroughly was, paradoxically, a flying tinderbox. Even as McCoy examined the recovered Betty in Luzon, the memory of those early missions seemed to echo through the hangar. He imagined Harrington's terror. The sailors aboard Prince of Wales and Repulse, facing a coordinated torpedo strike, the panic in Darwin as bombs rained from above. Each story revealed a pattern, brilliance tempered by fragility, precision coupled with peril. The Betty's designers had made a choice: superior speed and range at the expense of survivability. For a time, the gamble paid off spectacularly, but the question remained, how long could such dominance last when enemies adapted and learned from each encounter? The Betty story, however, was far from over. While the Allies were reeling, Japanese commanders were pushing the aircraft to new limits. Missions became longer, strikes more audacious, and the bomber's reputation grew. Across the Pacific, it became a symbol of both fear and awe. Yet beneath this reputation lay the silent threat of destruction from a single enemy bullet, a vulnerability that would eventually become the fulcrum on which the tides of war would pivot. If you want to uncover the hidden truths of World War II aviation and understand how one fragile aircraft reshaped the Pacific, subscribe and like. It helps bring history's lessons to more viewers, revealing stories often left untold in textbooks. As 1942 dawned, the Allies faced a stark reality. No airfield, no battleship, no strategic point was beyond reach. Yet the seeds of change were already being sown, unseen in the shadows of the early victories. And somewhere across the Pacific, engineers and pilots began to prepare for a fight that would test every lesson learned from the deadly beauty of the Betty. The skies were about to change, but no one yet knew how swiftly. By the early months of 1942, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty had transformed the skies over the Pacific into a theater of unchallenged Japanese dominance. From makeshift bases across the Philippines to the sun-baked airfields of the Solomons, Betty bombers struck with precision that seemed almost preordained. Darwin, more than 1,500 miles from Japanese territory, was reduced to smoldering ruins, its harbor littered with wreckage and stunned survivors. Port Moresby, hidden behind the jagged peaks of New Guinea, found its airfields constantly under bombardment, vulnerable to attacks that no Allied fighter could reach in time. Guadalcanal, still unfortified and under construction, trembled under reconnaissance flights that charted every inch of the island's terrain. The reach of the Betty was unrivaled, and yet its fragility loomed like a shadow over every mission. Despite this dominance, cracks in the armor of invincibility were beginning to appear. Allied reports, painstakingly compiled from survivors and intelligence, described a startling paradox. The Betty could fly hundreds of miles with near-perfect accuracy, but a single round could ignite an inferno. Pilots who survived initial encounters told tales of entire formations erupting into fireballs, earning the bomber nicknames such as the Flying Zippo. Yet even these horrifying accounts did not immediately stop the onslaught. Japanese strategy leaned heavily on the aircraft's range and speed, believing that preemption and surprise would offset the risk of catastrophic losses. In Darwin, survivors recalled the horror of waves of Betty bombers appearing almost out of nowhere. Artillery crews scrambled to man anti-aircraft guns as streaks of steel and fire cut across the sky. Buildings, warehouses, and supply depots were obliterated before anyone could mount an organized defense. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hank Phillips later reflected, "We were trained to fight, but against something that could appear over the horizon with no warning. There was little we could do." The psychological effect was terrifying. As each airfield burned, Allied commanders realized that the Japanese were not merely waging war on the ground. They were reshaping the very concept of air power. The Betty's design, however, was a double-edged sword. Its unarmored fuselage and lack of self-sealing fuel tanks made it both incredibly fast and incredibly vulnerable. Aircrews in the Philippines noted that the bomber's defensive guns, while manned with determination, could not compensate for structural weaknesses. Allied fighter pilots, initially scattered and under-equipped, were learning fast. Reports of formation losses began trickling in. A wingman caught in a crossfire could ignite an entire squadron, and a lucky shot could bring down a bomber designed for long-range strike. The Betty's brilliance lay in its reach. Its weakness lay in its vulnerability. Yet Japanese commanders pressed forward, confident in doctrine and operational audacity. Missions became longer, strikes more daring. Over Port Moresby, Betty formations executed bombing runs that tested the limits of fuel and navigation. Pilots flew low over treacherous terrain, dodging mountains and weather while aiming for tiny airstrips. It was a ballet of death, precise, elegant, and deadly. But every mission reminded Allied strategists of one undeniable truth: Speed alone could not make the aircraft invincible, and the cracks in its armor were already being charted. As the months passed, Allied intelligence pieced together fragments of the Betty's vulnerabilities, debriefings, captured maps, and survivor accounts hinted at a pattern. These bombers could be intercepted if proper tactics and aircraft were deployed. The realization sparked a quiet but urgent drive to develop fighters capable of catching the elusive Japanese formations. Somewhere in the shadows of Darwin and Guadalcanal, engineers sketched out the designs of the F-4U Corsair, the Hellcat, and the improved Wildcat planes built to exploit the weaknesses of the very bomber that had dominated the Pacific. Meanwhile, for the Japanese crews flying the Betty, every sortie was a gamble. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, veteran of raids over Darwin and Port Moresby, wrote in his diary, "We are the fastest, the farthest reaching, the most precise. Yet I fear one day the sky will not protect us, and the flames will come too quickly to escape." It was a foreboding note, barely heeded by command. For the moment, their air superiority remained uncontested, a terrifying symbol of Japan's tactical vision and the deadly marriage of speed, precision, and risk. But even as Japanese planes continued their strikes, the horizon hinted at change. Allied pilots were regrouping, training, and preparing for encounters that would turn the tide. The Betty, which had once been untouchable, was approaching a moment where its fragility could no longer be ignored. Reports from reconnaissance and skirmishes began hinting at vulnerabilities that could be exploited. One day, an intercepting squadron would find the Betty not a symbol of fear, but a target. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would redefine control of the Pacific skies. And across the islands, in the quiet spaces between attacks, whispers of a turning tide spread among Allied commanders. The knowledge of Japanese designs, their operational philosophy, and the very weaknesses of the Betty itself would soon form the blueprint for a counterstrike. Yet the Japanese remained unaware that the seeds of their aerial dominance were slowly being uprooted by men, machines, and strategies born of observation, patience, and calculated risk. By mid-1942, the skies over the Pacific were beginning to change. The Mitsubishi G4M, Betty, once untouchable, now faced an adversary it had not fully anticipated, a generation of Allied fighters built for speed, firepower, and resilience. The first glimpses of this shift appeared during engagements over Guadalcanal. On August 8, 1942, 23 Betty bombers from the Japanese 4th Air Group soared toward American positions, their engines humming in what they believed would be another routine strike. What they did not expect was the interception that awaited them over Savo Island. 18 of those bombers were shot down in minutes. Approximately 120 aviators perished in a sudden, merciless inferno. The age of Betty supremacy was meeting its first true test. Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn, leading a squadron of newly deployed F-4U Corsairs, recalled the engagement with a mix of awe and horror. "First time we caught a Betty formation. We couldn't believe how easy they went down. Hit anywhere along the fuselage or wings, and they'd explode." The very design that had allowed the Betty to dominate lightweight construction, extended range, minimal armor now rendered it a death trap. What had been a symbol of Japanese ingenuity became a hunting target, reshaping Allied tactics and morale in equal measure. The implications were immediate. Allied planners realized that air superiority was not a static prize, but a dynamic contest of adaptation and innovation. The Betty, once thought invincible, could now be lured into zones of vulnerability. Pilots began coordinating interception patterns, focusing fire on the bomber's unprotected fuel tanks and engine nays. Combined arms operations, integrated naval intelligence, radar tracking, and air reconnaissance, ensuring that no Japanese formation could operate unchallenged. The psychological advantage the Betty had once held over Allied crews began to erode, replaced by cautious confidence in growing tactical sophistication. Yet for the Japanese, victory still seemed possible. Missions continued with relentless precision, and crews pressed the boundaries of range and payload. Bombers struck with audacity from Rabaul to the Solomons, daring Allied defenses to respond, but each sortie exacted a heavier toll. Reports from pilots and intelligence officers chronicled a worrying pattern. Losses were mounting at an unsustainable rate, and replacement crews were increasingly inexperienced. The very doctrine that had fueled Japanese early success now threatened to accelerate their decline. November 1942 would bring a revelation that changed the course of Pacific warfare. Australian forces, pushing through New Guinea, captured intact Betty bombers at Japanese airfields. For the first time, Allied engineers and intelligence officers could examine the aircraft in detail. They documented the unarmored fuselage, the lack of self-sealing fuel tanks, the prioritization of speed over survivability, all the design choices that had made the bomber both formidable and fragile. The insights gained from these captured aircraft reshaped tactical doctrine. Interception strategies were refined, targeting patterns optimized, and Allied fighters were now deployed with the confidence that they could exploit the Betty's Achilles heel. For Japanese crews, the situation became increasingly perilous. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, veteran of multiple bombing campaigns, reflected in his diary, "The sky is no longer ours. Each mission carries the weight of uncertainty. Every fighter we meet may be our last." The very innovations that had once made the Betty a dominant weapon, its range, its agility, its precision, now exposed it to new forms of lethal calculation. The bomber's aura of invincibility, once unquestioned, had been shattered by human ingenuity, intelligence, and adaptation. Allied pilots, too, faced their own peril. Interceptions were dangerous and often costly, yet the payoff was undeniable. Every Betty shot down meant fewer strikes against airfields, supply lines, and naval forces. Every engagement honed skills and revealed weaknesses. The capture of intact bombers became a cornerstone of a broader learning curve, one that accelerated tactical and technological evolution across the Pacific. In a sense, the Betty itself had become a teacher, imparting lessons in aerodynamics, vulnerability, and strategy to those who would eventually dominate the skies. As the Allied counteroffensive gained momentum, the Pacific theater entered a new era. Japanese planners could no longer assume that speed and surprise alone would guarantee victory. Each mission carried the looming specter of loss, and the psychological weight of attrition began to sap morale. The bomber that had once ruled the early months of the war with unmatched authority was now facing a relentless, informed, and increasingly capable opponent. The turning of the skies was underway. If you want to see how intelligence, ingenuity, and tactical evolution reshaped the balance of power in the Pacific War, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every click helps uncover more hidden chapters of history, turning lessons of the past into understanding for the present. The stage was set for a dramatic evolution in aerial warfare. The Betty, once the terror of the Pacific, would continue to fly, but no longer unchallenged. Each sortie now risked destruction, and every battle carried consequences that could no longer be ignored. In the shadows of Guadalcanal and beyond, the seeds of Allied dominance were germinating, and the fragile beauty of the Betty, elegant yet deadly, would remain both a symbol of ambition and a warning of hubris. By 1945, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty had transitioned from a weapon of fear to a study in both triumph and error. Its operational history illustrated a stark lesson in warfare. Design philosophy and doctrine can determine not just victories, but the human cost of every decision. The Betty's early dominance over Clark Field, Foresea, Darwin, Port Moresby, and Guadalcanal demonstrated the power of long-range strike capabilities, precision, and tactical audacity. Yet the very characteristics that made it formidable, its speed, agility, and operational reach, were inseparable from its catastrophic vulnerabilities. For crews flying the Betty, each mission was a gamble with life and death hanging in the balance. Allied forces, through painstaking observation and the study of captured aircraft, began to grasp the depth of Japanese design choices. They discovered that the Betty's lack of armor and absence of self-sealing fuel tanks had been intentional, not accidental. Japanese engineers had prioritized offensive capability and operational range over crew protection. This gamble had paid off initially, allowing the bombers to terrorize distant targets across the Pacific. But as Allied fighters became faster, more maneuverable, and better armed, these design choices became fatal liabilities. The Betty's story revealed the thin line between audacity and hubris, a lesson etched in the skies over Guadalcanal and the Solomons. The Allied response illustrated the importance of adaptability in warfare. Engineers, strategists, and pilots applied the lessons learned from the Betty to refine aircraft design and develop new tactics. Interception patterns were optimized to exploit weaknesses, while emerging fighters like the F-4U Corsair, F-6, and Grumman Wildcat were deployed with precision. Intelligence officers used data gathered from captured bombers to anticipate enemy movements, predict vulnerabilities, and coordinate joint operations. In essence, the Betty had unknowingly taught its opponents how to defeat it. Yet beyond tactics and technology, the narrative of the Betty revealed a human dimension often overlooked. Every strike it flew, every mission it survived or failed, was a story of courage and sacrifice. Japanese crews faced extraordinary risks, flying aircraft designed to prioritize the mission over survival. Allied pilots, in turn, faced the daunting challenge of countering a bomber that had once seemed untouchable. Across oceans, islands, and airfields, the human cost of these decisions was measured in burned runways, sunken ships, and thousands of lives. The Betty was not merely a machine. It was a mirror reflecting the priorities, philosophies, and moral calculations of the men who designed it and those who flew against it. By the end of the Pacific War, the Betty had ceased to dominate the skies. Allied air superiority had been established, Japanese losses had mounted, and strategic momentum had shifted irrevocably. Yet its legacy endured. Military analysts, historians, and engineers studied the bomber's design to understand how operational philosophy could shape outcomes. Its influence persisted in the evolution of bomber design, highlighting the delicate balance between performance, protection, and sustainability. The story of the Betty became more than a tale of a single aircraft. It became a lesson in the integration of technology, strategy, and human factors in modern warfare. The campaigns of Clark Field, Force Z, Darwin, and Guadalcanal offered enduring lessons. Technology alone cannot guarantee dominance. Tactical innovation and intelligence can offset initial advantages, and the human costs of strategic decisions must never be underestimated. The Betty's story underscored the fact that every weapon carries both power and flaw, that every strategy carries risk, and that understanding the enemy, from engineering choices to battlefield tactics, is as vital as confronting them in combat. Today, historians look back at the Betty with a mixture of awe and caution. Its sleek lines and long range once seemed to promise invincibility, yet its fragility, exposed by experience and analysis, tells a story of ambition constrained by reality. The lessons of the Betty endure not only in the annals of military history but in the broader understanding of innovation, adaptation, and human courage under fire. From the first torpedo drops over 4Z to the bitter losses over Guadalcanal, the G4M bomber remains a symbol of both brilliance and vulnerability. A reminder that, in war, every advantage carries hidden costs, and every triumph carries lessons waiting to be learned. As the final echoes of engine roar fade into memory, the Betty stands immortalized. A machine that shaped battles, a teacher of strategy, and a warning of the delicate interplay between power, design, and human consequence. Its story, etched across the skies of the Pacific, reminds us that history is not merely about machines or battles, but about the choices, risks, and courage of those who operate within them.